Morning, everybody. I'll reiterate again, you should have gotten handouts when you came in. You should have two different scripture readings. One's Timothy 3, 1 Timothy 3, one is Titus 1. If you have two of the same scriptures, or only one of the scriptures, you should go rifle through the papers back there and mess up the collating and get the one you don't have. Because someone likely did that to you prior, so, I guess it's all fair. All right. Thank you so much for joining us this morning for our class on special servants. To date, we've discussed the work and purpose of three types of special servants. And then we've also spent a good bit of time about talking about the reason that we have special servants. You can read Ephesians 4 again if that's helpful to you. And then last week we talked about why special servants have authority, and specifically that the majority of their authority comes from the combination of how they reflect Christ's example and then how the flock follows and listens to them. You guys are going to want to get handouts from the back. 2 sheets. This morning, our topic is to talk about qualified servants overall. And so what I want to do first is to kind of talk about where we've come from in this discussion of qualified servants. Because historically, I think when we've talked about qualifications and being qualified, we have focused on a very small number of passages, really to the detriment or lack of thinking about qualification overall. And so I think what I want to present this morning is that I think there's primarily 4 things that work together to mean that we have someone who's qualified to be in one of these special servant roles. The first of those 3 things we've already talked about. So this is a bit of review. There shouldn't be anything here that's too surprising. And that's first, you should have people that can fulfill the work and the purpose that we see given to the varieties of special servants. Ephesians 4 lays that out really clearly, that we have special servants in order to help us grow in love and maturity so that the body works properly together. And so that's part of what this work and purpose is generally for special servants. But then we've added a few other things as we've studied over the last, call it 2 months. So they should be people who are serving actively now. If you have someone you believe or you think should be a special servant, but you don't see them actively doing the work that you want them to do for the entire congregation, you don't see them doing that in a small way now, you should question if they can fulfill that work and purpose for the broader group. They should be someone who's teaching, mentoring, and developing people so that we can attain to spiritual maturity and be prepared for works of service as laid out in Ephesians 4. Additionally, they should be someone who engages lovingly. That is specifically called out as a purpose of special servants in Ephesians. The works properly shows up there as well. And then kind of closing off this section, they should be someone who is faithful in small things and in small ways. I mentioned this a little bit already. But we should be able to identify the small flock that they support within the group today, that they are faithful in doing these top 4 things with, so that we can have belief or faith that when they are given charge for the entire group in some way, they're going to be faithful in larger things as well. Second, they should reflect Christ. I've listed a few things. I think you can pick a lot more ways that they can reflect Christ. But they should care for the lowly. They should extend grace and mercy, meaning they don't expect perfection from everyone. They expect the pursuit of righteousness. They should share the gospel freely. They aren't looking at, well, does this person look like me? Do they think like me? Do I agree with them? Instead, they're sharing the gospel with all peoples and showing them care frequently. And then finally in this section, I would say they need to be gentle with nearly all people or in nearly all situations. There are times when special servants, especially elders and evangelists, are going to be called to rebuke or chastise or correct. Those should be exceptions, not every time. Their gentleness is a primary aspect of how they reflect Christ. Just like Christ was gentle in nearly every engagement we see in the Gospels, except a very small number, and all of those were dealing with sin. Think of how he interacted sometimes with the Pharisees, or how he interacted in the temple and overthrew the money changers' tables, right? All of those scenarios where we see Christ's anger, they were very focused on significant sin. All other times, reflecting Christ would be reflecting his gentleness. And then finally, in these items we've talked about a little bit already, the sheep or the flock should hear his voice and follow it. And that should be something that's happening before they are appointed to a role as a special servant. If there is not a significant amount of the group that hears and follows the voice of the special servant, especially a shepherd, prior to being appointed, that should be a big concern about whether or not people can hear and follow after they're appointed. Some ways that you would see that would be that they are sought out for guidance and counsel on a broad range of topics by a broad range of people. Some of those will be, how do we make wise decisions? How do I address this issue with my family? How do I proceed in this way? But that when people are seeking guidance, especially spiritual guidance, they are going to the shepherds, the to-be shepherds, before they've been appointed. Their influence creates change. And what I mean by that is when someone who is going to be a shepherd, or we think could be a shepherd especially, when they tell people that they have a concern about something, or they cite something that they think we should do or consider, ideally at least some part of the group is listening to that and saying, hey, this is someone that I trust. This is someone who I believe in their spiritual relationship with, their understanding of Scripture. And so they don't have to exert formal authority. Instead, their influence creates change, and I would say it creates change for good, right? That's part of the working properly in love in that first column. This is related to that. They have informal authority. So that's about influence, but if you remember back to when Matt Henneke talked to us about formal authority versus informal authority, all leaders have some level of formal authority and some level of informal authority. And the catch is, generally, the usage of formal authority needs to be very limited, and also it usually doesn't work out really great. I mean, sometimes usage of formal authority, if it's done really well and infrequently, things can go well. And what I mean by formal authority is, I'm in this position, so you have to do what I say. Right? That's formal authority. I have authority because of the seat that I'm in or the place that I fill. As opposed to informal authority, which is concepts like influencing others or people looking to you for guidance, not because necessarily the position you're in, but because of who you are. And that kind of leans back on that reflecting Christ column as well. And then finally in this kind of the sheep hear and follow section kind of brings you full circle back to fulfilling the work and purpose. Special servants should bring peace, they should bring safety, and they should bring calm to the group. If someone is creating rancor before they're a special servant, making them a special servant is not going to make that better. Instead, it's going to put fuel on that fire because you will give them some measure of formal authority when you ask them to fill this seat for the entire group. What questions or comments do people have about this discussion of qualified servants so far? I've seen about 10 people taking pictures of this slide. I'll just send them to you guys. That way you can have them. I'm surprised that people like this slide a lot, actually. I reformatted it about 19 times last night, so I'm glad that it's helpful. Any questions or comments? Belinda?
This is spot on. I agree 100%. I think our challenge would be to find men who met these things, but at the same time understand that this is an ideal list. So everyone cannot be everyone that's qualified has to be well on their way, but they don't necessarily have to achieve every single category, because if that's true, we're going to have a hard time, I think, appointing. Now, when I say it, I understand within these, like influence creates change, okay? Yeah, okay. That's true, it does. But to what degree? Okay, so I guess I'm thinking more degrees.
Yeah, I don't think we can or should expect everyone to do every one of these things perfectly. But what I would say, from my perspective, what we're about to look at in 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1, my opinion is that we have often said people need to fill every one of those things perfectly, and we've never talked about these things. And I would say my opinion is, I think these things need to be fulfilled more completely, and the lists in 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1 maybe should not be approached so clearly as a checklist. And what I would say is, talk about the headings a little bit here. Fulfilling the work and purpose, reflecting Christ, sheep hear and follow. The items underneath those, I think we can debate what should go where and if there should be more or less. I think the categories, though, are pretty clear in what we've studied the last few weeks. The individual items underneath them, I think you could debate a lot. Chip?
Another way to say that, because of what you just said about going to 1 Timothy and Titus, is generally it's the other way around. We have people who will say, we have qualified men, we ought to be talking to them about whether or not it's a special servant. And they're thinking about the things in 1 Timothy and Titus.
Yes.
They're not thinking about these things.
Yes.
Make that comment.
Yeah, and that's exactly how I would hope that when we consider special servants, especially elders and deacons, that is the order that we would go in. That we would first look at these columns. I think you could or should put reflect Christ first if you're going to say these are ordinal. I put them in the order in which we studied them, not the order in which of importance. But I would say we would think about special servants and how we appoint them and when we appoint them and who we appoint much differently if we first said, do they do these things before we look at those other passages? Brian?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. The men who are doing this, those qualifications in 1 Timothy will fall in line. That they're going to have those qualities in order to be able to do this.
Odds are. I completely agree. Completely. Jared?
Yeah, just generally observing this as well, and just wanted to note how impactful and how different this list is when we consider deacons to what is sort of typically the case that we see with deacons, where we consider, is this like a hard-working man that can get stuff done? Or is he this kind of shepherd leader that reflects Christ in a much more spiritual leadership role than just a guy that can, do maintenance and things like that? That is sometimes the case with deacons.
Yeah, I agree. What we're going to do is we're going to look at 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1. Those are the usual suspects when we talk about this topic. If you look at this slightly grayer and less bold scriptures underneath that, most of those we have studied in this class already. But what I would tell you is, if you're going to try to build a fulsome list of quote-quote qualifications if you're only looking at 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1, you are failing in your effort to build a picture of a qualified servant. That's at least partly because you would be failing in an effort to build a picture of a Christian. Because our special servants should fully reflect what it means to be a Christian. And 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1 don't say everything there is to say about that. And so that's all of those things are part of why I've structured this special servants class completely differently than any I've really ever been a part of. And it's because the ideal to me is building and looking primarily for men that fulfill a much broader set of qualifications and reflections as opposed to what is frequently done with 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1. Now, we're going to do that this morning. I'm not saying you shouldn't, but I'm simply saying when you study this on your own or with others, if you're really going to build a list of things you're looking for, you should use at least these other 7 passages, and you could probably find 7 more just as quickly that you should be using as well to consider that. Any questions before we go on to reading 1 Timothy 3? I'll give you guys a heads up what we're going to do. We're going to read 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1. We're going to talk a little bit about how we consider those, and then we're actually going to kind of break into some groups, and I'm going to ask you guys to do some work together. I'm giving you a warning so you can start taking deep breaths. We're going to do something different. You might have to get out of your seat. You're going to have to talk to people. It's going to be really trying. So I want to give you some time to mentally prepare for that. In case anyone didn't get them, there are handouts in the back. 2 pages. 1 Timothy 3 should be on one. Titus 1 should be on the other. And then they have backs that we'll use as well. Let's start now and read 1 Timothy 3. The saying is trustworthy. If anyone aspires to the office of overseer, he desires a noble task. Therefore, an overseer must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not a drunkard, not violent but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. He must manage his own household well with all dignity, keeping his children submissive. For if someone does not know how to manage his own household, how will he care for God's church? He must not be a recent convert, or he may be puffed up with conceit and fall into the condemnation of the devil. Moreover, he must be well thought of by outsiders, so that he may not fall into disgrace, into a snare of the devil. Deacons likewise must be dignified, not double-tongued, not addicted to much wine, not greedy for dishonest gain. They must hold the mystery of the faith with a clear conscience, and let them also be tested first. Then let them serve as deacons, if they prove themselves blameless. Their wives likewise must be dignified, not slanderers, but sober-minded, faithful in all things. Let deacons each be the husband of one wife, managing their children and their own households well. Oh my Lord. Managing their children and their own households well. For those who serve well as deacons gain a good standing for themselves, and also great confidence in the faith that is in Christ Jesus. So, when we read 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1 together, we just read the first one, there's one problem that should pop out to you immediately. Do you guys know what that problem is before we go look at Titus 1?
They don't always match.
They don't match. And that is so frustrating. Wouldn't it just be easier if Paul had CC'd Titus on, his email and been like, hey man, you could get another email, but just see what I wrote Timothy. He doesn't do that. And so in some ways we have to spend some time thinking about how we handle that. There's a couple ways you could explain that they're different. One of them is you could kind of think what I just said, and that is that, well, Titus had Timothy's list and Timothy had Titus's list, so their lists are slightly different, but that was okay because they had each other's letters, and so they would have both reflected on each of them. I don't think that makes sense. I think there's a lot of problems with that, including you're making like a couple huge leaps of assumption in that. And you'd also say, well, if that's the case, in some ways, like, well, why did Titus even get a letter if he had Timothy's, right? Wouldn't he have just said like, hey, see that stuff I wrote Timothy? So I think that's a bit of a problem. You could say that the needs of the groups were different. And so as a result, they have different lists or different requirements. That causes me a different set of heartburn, because that means everybody got custom lists, and we don't actually see that. We don't see other groups getting custom lists, and we don't have a custom list. So then what do? Do we build our own custom list, or do we like add these together and make one list for like elders or not? I think it gets a little problematic if you kind of take option 1 or option 2. The way I think about this, and this is not a unique thing, is that there's one qualification, maybe 2. I'll explain that why I said maybe 2 in a minute. I think there's one qualification, and that is the idea of blamelessness. And that each of these quote, quote, qualifications, like husband of one wife, for lack of a better term, we're just going to say like each of those phrases is a qualification, that each of those qualifications is a way to perceive the blamelessness of the man that we're evaluating for service. I don't think this is a perfect way to look at it. I did say that I think there may be a second one, and that is desire. 1 Timothy 3 begins with desire, and then if you kind of bring in another passage, 1 Peter 5 very clearly says desire is necessary. So potentially you could say desire and blamelessness are the qualifications, and then these are all examples of how to perceive blamelessness. Any questions on that or thoughts? Barry?
I agree with your conclusion. I might add one thing. But blamelessness is in both texts, exactly.
Yeah.
And highlighted, in fact, 2 times in one of the texts. The other way of looking at that, or just an additional way of looking at that, is that both sets of qualifications are really the same.
Yeah.
And that they're just said differently. We run to Titus and say, well, he has to have believing children. And then we're basically saying, well, Timothy, he didn't say that to Timothy. And that, as you said, brings about some heartburn. The Timothy appointed man, or it is when he says believing children. This is something we get into.
Yeah.
Or faithful children, as some of this is this faithfulness to Dad and what Dad is teaching and what Dad is saying, more than a specific, did he get baptized?
Yeah, and we're going to talk about that in just a minute. Yeah, you could also, the fourth way is you just say, hey, they're the same. Stop being nitpicky, guys. That's how Barry would say it, just a little differently than that, but that's how Barry would say it. What we want to do this morning is, the way I think about this and study it is more in the form of categories. And so that's because there's a couple reasons why I do it, why I generally think about it in categories, and also why in this class I'm doing it in categories. One is, I don't really want to go through each of these individual things and talk about them. We don't have time for it. It's a lot, and to do it well, it would take a whole quarter, in my opinion, if you were going to study each one. So we're not doing that. The second reason is, I think when you go through each of them individually and study them that way, you actually naturally start to push yourself towards a checklist mentality. Well, does he have this? Does he have this? Does he have this? All right, he's qualified. And I think that's very much not how we should do this. The third reason why I think about this as categories a little bit is, and I've hinted at this a little bit before, is frequently these lists are presented as comprehensive and exhaustive. And I don't think that's true. Like, they have lots of aspects, there are lots of aspects of being a Christian that aren't mentioned in these passages. And so when we study them one by one in really deep detail and then like focus on them that much, what we do is we focus on the individual items and we don't say, in the aspect of family, would we find this man blameless? So, for example, that's one of the categories I think almost anyone's going to come up with in their list. On the back of one of your sheets, you have some handwritten notes from me. What I've done is I've taken each passage and I've just written down what each of those qualification sort of phrases is. The color's kind of hard to see. Well, it's easier on that screen. The color's kind of hard to see. If it's in red, it's from 1 Timothy 3 and it's about elders. If it's in green, it's from 1 Timothy 3 and it's about deacons. If it's in purple, it's from Titus 1 and it's about elders. So one controversial thing I'm going to do right now is we're not going to talk about elders and deacons' qualifications as being different. That's because I don't actually think they're different. They all have the qualification of being blameless. Now, you might want to bring in the concept of, well, Titus says that they need to have children who believe. But really outside of that, I don't know that the qualifications for elders and deacons are that different. And in our discussion of deacons, part of what we have talked about is deacons should be able to be empowered and they should be able to remove burden from the elders. And I believe that a primary way that that's made possible is if we seek them to have a higher standard of qualification than we frequently have. More like that of an elder than that of something else that is lesser, is sometimes how they're treated. And I think Scripture presents them more as equals than it does as a hierarchical situation. I'm not going to be dogmatic on that. Like, we can study it differently with different ways, but we're going to talk about them all together. Barry kind of hinted at one of the issues with looking at this with the family thing. One, how many children are required? All the passages say children, none of them say child. Is that singular? Is that plural? There are brethren who very much believe it needs to be multiple children. There are brethren who totally fine if it's one children. Second, the aspect here of in Titus, the call out believing children. In 1 Timothy 3, children are referred to as submissive, and then also in children are not debaucherous or insubordinate. I messed that up, sorry. And then all of them talk about managing a household well. But the children issue, do they believe? Some translate that, as Barry did from Titus 1, as faithful. For example, if you use the Holman Christian is going to translate that as faithful. If you have an ESV that has footnotes, in the text it's going to say believing, but it's going to have a footnote that says or faithful. And so then you get into a discussion of, is that believing or faithful to our Heavenly Father, or, as 1 Timothy 3 might lead you to think a little bit more, is that actually believing and faithful to their earthly fathers? Because in 1 Timothy, the discussion is, are the children submissive? Are they not debaucherous? Are they not insubordinate? And would you say that their household is managed well? So those are some of the issues that you see kind of within the topic of family. One benefit that first looking at this as blamelessness gives us is we don't actually have to resolve all of those. And instead we can ask, in regards to this man's family and whether or not he manages his household well, would we consider him blameless? Or would we say, hey, you can tell that this man has some issues in his family. All of his children are wild. They're out of control. They do not submit. But they've all been baptized, which I have seen. and I have seen in elders that were appointed, is they had baptized children that you would not describe as submissive, and you would certainly describe as insubordinate, even if you wouldn't say debaucherous. And so a man can have believing children that are baptized and not fulfill the rest of these qualifications. And that's part of why I like to look at this in terms of categories. Any questions? Comments? All right, let's read Titus 1. And we're just going to read down through from verse 5 to verse 9. That is why I left you in Crete, so that you might put what remained into order, and appoint elders in every town as I directed you. If anyone is above reproach, the husband of one wife, and his children are believers, and not open to the charge of debauchery or insubordination. For an overseer as God's steward must be above reproach. He must not be arrogant or quick-tempered or a drunkard or violent or greedy for gain, but hospitable, a lover of good, self-controlled, upright, holy, and disciplined. He must hold firm to the trustworthy word as taught, so that he may be able to give instruction in sound doctrine, and also to rebuke those who contradict it. So what I want us to do now is we're going to break into 4 groups. And so Judy and forward over here is going to be group 1. You guys are going to go up there in just a minute, all right? Group 2 back here, conveniently, y'all get to stay where you are. Congratulations. Group 3 is going to be from Michael and Jerry. Y'all are going to go up here. And then group 4 will be the back. Call it 3 rows right now. So what we're going to do is you have two sheets that you should be using now. I just gave mine away. One has a table on the back. Your goal is to create 4 to 6 categories that you can see up here. So 4 to 6, I've kind of given you one. I think it's going to be hard for you not to have family. So odds are family is going to be one of those. Try to create 4 to 6 categories. You have some space here where you could write some of those qualifications if you wanted to. You're going to be asked, is there anything that you weren't able to group well once you created categories? For example, my current grouping, I have 4 that don't really fit anywhere. So just calling that out. They're not going to be perfect. But then I also want you to give thought to, are there any downsides to the way you're grouping? Are you overemphasizing something or underemphasizing something? I'm asking you to do these things instead of thinking about the pros, because you created the list, so you're for it. So you don't have to tell me why you like it. But I do think it's important that as we all consider bias in our decision making, we proactively identify what's wrong with our way of thinking about something and not just what's right with it. And then you have that handwritten sheet that has all of those qualifications written out in case you want to use that as some level of summary, so you're not trying to look at multiple pages of 1 Timothy 3 and Titus. So we're going to break into groups for just a little bit, and then we'll talk about that, and then we'll have some more things after that. All right, ready, break. All right. Group 1, stay where you're at. Group 1, what do you guys have in terms of categories?
Well, we kept family.
Okay.
Everybody has family.
Character was one that was specifically defined. Did we come up with a title for the second or for the third one? Reputation.
All right, family. You said reputation or character? Are those two separate?
Personal character, and then reputation.
Personal character, all right. And then reputation. Okay.
One that I would call stewardship, because I like that, but relating to money, ability to manage one's own finances, or as a leader of finances.
All right, so you'd say stewardship / finances. Okay. Any others?
Spiritual maturity, spiritual maturity. And Discipline, lifestyle.
Spiritual maturity and discipline. Okay? Any cons or things you didn't handle well? Say you were perfect?
I think something that was brought up is simply the idea that a lot of these are going to obviously overlap a lot, but I think they are fairly all encompassing.
Okay.
And our point with that, Adam, was that, for example, some personal characteristics are important, but they will impact your reputation.
Right. Yeah.
So they could be in more than one. These are not mutually exclusive
Yeah.
in their categorization. You can have it in more than one place, is the way we went.
I think one thing that's interesting is your fourth one, stewardship and finance. The passages don't say a single thing about money. They do say you're God's steward, and they do say you manage your household well. But in terms of emphasis, I guess they say you're not in it for gain. Yeah, that's fair. I would say I wonder about the emphasis there on the financial, personally, but that it's not wrong, like you said. Like we all got to categorize it somehow. All right, group 2. What do you guys have?
We have 3 categories.
3 categories. All right, I love it. 4. Are you sure you should be talking?
No, I'm not.
You were 33% wrong.
All right, so
Uh-oh.
you're right. I'm just going to read it. So,
He's going to read Ariel's, which is like a little synopsis of... Never mind.
So we have family.
Family, great.
Then we have character traits.
Okay.
Personal character traits. And then we have relational, which kind of the idea of just relating to other people.
Relational, as in people, not databases.
Yes.
Okay.
And then spiritual well-being or maturity as well.
Okay, spiritual well-being. It's interesting, I kind of like the well-being in addition to the maturity, because those are different. They're not the same. Any cons or things you've overlooked, overemphasized? No? You guys think you were perfect? Overlapping
of things.
Okay. We did not get to group 3 and 4. I'm going to ask people to email those to me if you have them from group 3 or group 4.